Do not move a single muscle and pretend you are still in a coma. The urgent, desperate whisper of Clara, the night nurse, barely registered in my ringing ears as I slowly fought my way back to consciousness. The harsh smell of clinical antiseptic and the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor next to my bed grounded me to reality. I had just survived a massive car crash on the interstate. Before I could even process the heavy bandages wrapping my head or the searing pain radiating through my chest, a sharp clacking of designer heels echoed on the cold linoleum floor outside my room. I kept my eyes shut tight and forced my breathing to remain shallow and steady. My mother Beatrice marched into the room alongside my older sister Clara and my white brother-in-law Preston. Cancel her physical therapy immediately. My mother ordered the attending staff, her voice ice cold, without a single shred of maternal warmth or sorrow. Do not waste another dollar on a lost cause. Kiara let out a soft, highly satisfied laugh. I could hear her manicured fingers brushing against the metal footboard of my bed. This works out perfectly, she murmured to her husband. I will take her luxury Buckhead mansion and you can drive that brand new Mercedes. It is not like this useless girl will ever wake up to use them anyway. The moment the heavy hospital door clicked shut behind them, I snapped my eyes open. I reached up and pulled the oxygen tube from my nose. I turned to the stunned nurse and spoke with a raspy but razor-sharp voice. Call my lawyer right now because it is time to trap them. The silence in the room was deafening, but my mind was moving at lightning speed. I had just survived a horrific pileup, and instead of crying or praying for my recovery, my own flesh and blood were busy carving up my life like vultures circling a carcass. I lay there staring at the ceiling tiles while Clara locked the door. My heart pounded against my bruised ribs, but I refused to shed a single tear. I had stopped crying over these people a long time ago. Less than an hour later, the door creaked open again. I quickly closed my eyes, steadying my heart rate on the monitor. It was Preston. I could smell his expensive, arrogant cologne, mixed with the stale hospital air. He was not alone. A man with a deep, raspy voice accompanied him, spreading thick paper documents across my rolling bedside table. Here is the power of attorney, Preston whispered eagerly. I practiced her signature all week, and it looks completely flawless. Once the doctors agree to pull the plug tomorrow morning, we can liquidate her bank accounts and put the house on the market before the ink on her death certificate even dries. The lawyer chuckled quietly. You are a cold man, Preston, but this document gives you full legal control over everything Ebony owns. Just make sure the family is fully on board with pulling life support. Oh, Beatrice and Kiara are completely ready, Preston replied smoothly with a dark chuckle. They have hated her for years, and they cannot wait to cash in on her pathetic life. They think she is just a struggling nobody with a lucky house. Hearing his entitled, arrogant voice standing right over my broken body triggered a visceral, incredibly painful memory from 10 years ago. I was 19 years old, standing in my mother's pristine living room, begging for just a fraction of the college tuition I desperately needed to finish my degree. I had worked 3 grueling minimum wage jobs just to afford my textbooks and rent. Beatrice had stood in front of me holding a thick stack of cash that I thought was meant for my education. She had always obsessed over our family image in the Atlanta high society, constantly boasting at her country club about her perfect older daughter. I was the dark-skinned, awkward child who never fit her pristine mold. Instead of helping me, she threw the bills, violently hitting me right in the chest. This money is not for a failure like you, she had screamed, her eyes full of utter disgust. This money is to pay for Kiara and Preston's extravagant European honeymoon. An ugly, failing girl like you will only ever be a lowly employee anyway. You are a complete embarrassment to this upscale family. Get out of my house right now. She threw me out into the freezing Atlanta rain with nothing but a black trash bag filled with cheap clothes. They thought I would end up destitute on the streets. They thought I would amount to absolutely nothing. They had no idea that the broken girl they threw away had spent the last decade building a financial empire from the ground up. Today, I am 29 years old and the founder and chief executive officer of E Holdings, a private equity firm that controls billions in assets across the Southeast. I waited in absolute stillness until Preston and his shady lawyer finally packed up their forged papers and left the room. The moment the coast was clear, I sat up, ignoring the searing white-hot pain radiating from my fractured ribs. I looked at Clara, who was watching me with wide, terrified eyes. She had heard every single word of their murderous plot. "I need my cell phone," I told her firmly. When she handed it to me from my personal belongings bag, I dialed the private unlisted number of my lead corporate attorney, Julian. He answered on the second ring. I told him exactly what hospital I was in and what equipment he needed to bring immediately. Julian arrived 45 minutes later, slipping undetected through the staff entrance with a secure laptop and a portable encrypted scanner. He stood by my bed, looking at my extensive bruises with deep concern, but I raised a hand to stop his pity. "We do not have time for sympathy, Julian," I said, pulling the hospital table closer to my chest. "Preston has a forged power of attorney and plans to drain my personal accounts tomorrow morning. We are going to let him do it." Julian looked at me as if the crash had literally damaged my brain. "Ebony, if he executes that document, he can touch your primary portfolios and empty everything you have worked for." "No, he cannot," I replied, typing rapidly on his encrypted laptop. "I am transferring 99% of my liquid assets, real estate holdings, and stock portfolios into a secure blind trust under a shell corporation immediately. We are going to leave exactly one personal checking account active and exposed. I routed exactly $50,000 into that decoy account, making sure it was completely untethered from my corporate holdings." Julian watched the screen in awe as the massive wealth I had accumulated vanished behind impenetrable layers of corporate security, leaving only the bait dangling in the open. "You are leaving $50,000 for him to steal?" Julian asked, finally understanding the brilliant trap I was setting. "Yes," I smiled coldly, ignoring the physical pain in my body. $50,000 is enough to make him feel like he hit the jackpot because he firmly believes that is all a failure like me could possibly save. He thinks his white privilege and corporate title give him the ultimate right to just take what belongs to a black woman he deems inferior. He underestimated me 10 years ago, and he is making the exact same fatal mistake today. But more importantly, $50,000 crosses the exact legal threshold for first-degree felony wire fraud and grand larceny in the state of Georgia. If I stop him right now, he just gets a slap on the wrist for a forged piece of paper. If I let him take the money, he commits a federal crime that carries a mandatory prison sentence. He will not be able to buy his way out of this one with his fancy corporate salary." Julian nodded, an expression of pure, absolute respect crossing his face. He processed the trust documents right there in the dim light of the hospital room, securing my entire empire safely out of their greedy reach. "Now we have to make sure they actually go through with pulling the plug," I told him, my voice steady and resolute. "They need to believe they won the ultimate prize so they can celebrate their victory right before I completely destroy them." I turned back to Clara, the nurse who had been standing guard by the locked door. "I need to disappear tonight," I told her, keeping my voice calm. "If they come back tomorrow and see me awake, they will panic and scrap the entire plan. I need them to think I was transferred to a hospice facility for terminal patients." Clara did not hesitate for a single second. She had seen the pure evil radiating from my mother and sister, and she wanted to help me take them down. She quickly accessed the hospital database and falsified a transfer order, stating that my condition had rapidly deteriorated, and I was moved to a palliative care unit on the other side of the city. Julian arranged for a private secure medical transport to arrive at the loading dock precisely at midnight. We worked quickly and silently in the shadows, avoiding the main security cameras. I unhooked myself from the heart monitors, carefully replacing the medical sensors on a rolled-up bundle of extra blankets hidden strategically under the hospital sheets. In the dim lighting, it looked exactly like a motionless body clinging to life. I put on the oversized hoodie and sweatpants Julian had brought for me, wincing sharply as the heavy fabric pulled against my fresh stitches. Every step was agonizing, but the thought of finally delivering justice fueled my movements. As I walked toward the exit, leaning heavily on Julian for physical support, I looked back at the empty bed one last time. My mother, my sister, and my brother-in-law were going to walk into this room tomorrow morning, ready to end my life for a house and a car. They were going to sign their names on documents that would seal their own permanent destruction. I stepped into the freight elevator and disappeared into the dark Atlanta night, completely erasing myself from their radar. The trap was set perfectly and the bait was waiting to be taken. 2 agonizing weeks passed since I vanished into the shadows of the Atlanta night. Julian had secured a highly classified private recovery facility for me on the outskirts of the city, where only trusted medical professionals had access to my room. My fractured ribs ached with every breath, and the heavy bandages still wrapped tightly around my head were a constant reminder of the horrific crash I had barely survived. But the physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to the cold, calculating anticipation burning inside my chest. Every single morning, Julian would sit beside my bed, opening his encrypted laptop to show me the surveillance we had set up on my decoy bank account. We were waiting for the trap to spring, and it required immense patience. I spent hours staring at the blank ceiling tiles, visualizing exactly how they would fall into the snare. I knew my family better than they knew themselves. Their greed was a bottomless pit that could never be filled. On the 14th day, the notification finally arrived. I was slowly drinking a glass of water when the encrypted alert chimed from Julian's computer screen. The bait had been taken. Julian turned the monitor toward me, his expression grim but satisfied. Preston and Clara had actually done it. They had walked into the hospital room that morning, completely expecting to watch me take my last breath. They had signed the fraudulent power of attorney papers, using the signature Preston had spent weeks practicing. They pulled the plug on what they thought was my life support, and without wasting a single second of mourning, they had marched straight to the bank. The screen showed a massive wire transfer, exactly $50,000, completely draining the single exposed account I had left behind. They truly believed they had just successfully robbed a dead woman. They thought that $50,000 represented my entire life savings. The sheer audacity of their crime was breathtaking. They had legally and intentionally committed first-degree felony wire fraud and grand larceny. They had crossed the line of no return and handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them. Staring at that zero balance on the screen, a sudden wave of dark memories flooded my mind. Preston's arrogant theft brought me right back to our family Thanksgiving dinner just a few years ago. The memory tasted like dry turkey and bitter resentment. My mother Beatrice had insisted on hosting the dinner at her pretentious suburban house, aiming to impress her church friends and country club acquaintances. I had driven straight from my office exhausted after working an 80-hour week, but I had still shown up trying to maintain some semblance of family connection. Preston had positioned himself at the head of the table, acting as the supreme patriarch of the family, simply because he was a white man working in corporate finance. He wore a smug, self-satisfied grin as he looked down the table at me. He had just bought Clara a new designer handbag, and the entire room was fawning over his generosity. When the conversation inevitably turned to my life, Preston did not hold back. He leaned forward, swirling his expensive wine, and looked at me with absolute pity and disgust. "You really need to figure your life out." Ebony Preston had sneered in front of the entire extended family. "You are a failed black woman with no future. You have no husband, no real career, and no prospects. You are just going to drag this family down with your endless struggling." The room had fallen completely silent, but the silence was not in my defense. I looked across the table at my mother, desperately hoping she would finally protect her own biological daughter. Instead, Beatrice just slowly nodded her head, taking another sip of her wine and agreeing with every single word the arrogant white man had just said. Clara had laughed, covering her mouth, trying to hide her cruel amusement. They all sat there, judging me, measuring my worth by my lack of a flashy husband or a loud social media presence. They treated me like the ultimate charity case, the embarrassing stain on their pristine upscale image. Little did they know the woman they were mocking was currently orchestrating one of the largest financial acquisitions in the state of Georgia. While they were busy maxing out credit cards to buy designer belts, I was sleeping on an office floor, building a private equity firm from absolute scratch. I had suffered through countless rejections, racial prejudice, and gender bias in the corporate world to establish a holdings. I was already a multimillionaire while Preston was still fetching coffee for senior partners at his firm. I chose to stay silent that Thanksgiving, swallowing my pride, because my wealth was my armor, and I refused to let their toxic hands touch what I had built. They saw a quiet, struggling girl, but I was already a titan in the making. The memory faded, bringing me back to the sterile quiet of my private recovery room. The sting of that Thanksgiving insult no longer held any power over me. It only fueled the absolute destruction I was preparing to unleash. I asked Julian to open the remote security application on his tablet. Before the accident, I had installed hidden high-definition cameras in every single room of my luxury Buckhead mansion. It was a massive, sprawling property with floor-to-ceiling windows, a custom chef's kitchen, and a master suite that rivaled any five-star hotel. My family had never seen the inside of it. They did not even know the house belonged to me, since the deed was securely hidden behind a corporate trust. But somehow Preston had tracked down the address using his fraudulent paperwork. I watched the live feed with a chilling sense of calm. The front door of my sanctuary swung open, and my mother walked in, followed closely by Clara. They did not look like grieving family members who had just lost a daughter and a sister. They looked like lottery winners arriving to collect their prize. The security cameras captured their every move in crystal-clear resolution. Beatrice marched straight into my home office, grabbing a stack of black heavy-duty trash bags from the kitchen. I watched my own mother violently sweep my personal belongings off the shelves. She threw away my favorite books, my framed college degree, and the small keepsakes I had collected over the years. She dumped my entire life into the garbage without a single moment of hesitation or sorrow. She was moving with ruthless efficiency, complaining out loud about my supposedly cheap taste and how quickly they needed to clear the space for an open house. She actually complained about the dust on a picture frame while tossing it into the bag. It was the ultimate betrayal captured permanently on digital video. A mother erasing her child from existence just to make a quick profit. In the master bedroom, the scene was even more grotesque. Clara had flung open the doors to my massive walk-in closet. She let out a loud, piercing squeal of delight when she saw the rows of designer clothes, custom shoes, and luxury bags I had collected but rarely wore to family events. She did not question how a supposed failure could afford such things. Her greed completely blinded her logic. I watched through the camera lens as my sister stripped off her jacket and began trying on my clothes. She twirled in front of my full-length mirror, posing and laughing while wearing a silk gown I had bought for a charity gala. She grabbed my expensive jewelry, fastening my necklaces around her throat and admiring her reflection. "This is all mine now," she squealed to herself, dancing around the bedroom of her supposedly dead sister. She looked so incredibly happy, so victorious. She was literally dancing on my grave and celebrating the theft of my life. I felt a profound, permanent shift inside my soul as I watched the screen. Any lingering shred of familial obligation, any tiny droplet of hope that they might actually care about me, evaporated into pure nothingness. The tears I had refused to shed in the hospital were entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating void. They were not my family. They were parasites who had fed on my misery for years and were now trying to feed on my corpse. I asked Julian to close the camera feed because I had seen absolutely everything I needed to see. The evidence was securely backed up to multiple cloud servers. Every trash bag my mother filled and every dress my sister tried on was just another nail in their legal coffin. Julian pulled up a different window on his laptop, tracing the exact path of the $50,000 Preston had stolen from my decoy account. Preston thought he was a financial genius, but he was incredibly sloppy. He had not bothered to wash the funds through a secondary account. He wired the stolen money directly from my compromised bank account straight to a commercial vendor. Julian traced the routing number and the receiving institution. The destination made me laugh out loud, despite the sharp pain in my ribs. Preston had wired the entire $50,000 to the Chateau Elite Club. It was the most exclusive, ridiculously expensive private country club in the entire metropolitan Atlanta area. An establishment known for its massive crystal chandeliers, marble staircases, and an entry fee that required severe generational wealth. I looked at Julian seeking confirmation, and he simply nodded his head. Preston used your stolen money to place a non-refundable deposit for a wildly extravagant anniversary party, Julian explained, tracing the transaction details on the screen. He booked the grand ballroom, the premium catering package, and a live string quartet. He is planning to host the event this coming weekend to celebrate his wedding anniversary with your sister. The absolute audacity of the plan left me momentarily speechless. Preston had literally stolen the last pennies of a woman he believed he just murdered to throw a lavish party for himself and his wife. He intended to invite the entire Atlanta elite, his corporate bosses from Vanguard Holdings, and all the pretentious church friends my mother desperately wanted to impress. They were going to use my stolen money to officially launch themselves into high society. They wanted to stand in that glamorous ballroom sipping expensive champagne and pretending they had finally arrived at the top of the social ladder. They honestly believed they were untouchable. They thought their flawless white knight had successfully outsmarted the system and secured their wealthy future. They thought the pathetic black sheep of the family was quietly rotting in a morgue completely out of their way. They had no idea that every single move they made was being meticulously tracked, documented, and added to a federal criminal file. They had no idea that the money they stole was pocket change compared to the financial empire I actually controlled. They had absolutely no idea that the woman they were going to celebrate with my money was currently sitting in a private facility preparing to end their entire existence. I turned to Julian and gave him my next set of instructions. My voice was completely devoid of emotion, running on pure, calculated strategy. I told him to let the transaction clear. I told him not to block the deposit or alert the authorities just yet. I wanted Preston to host that party. I wanted my mother to buy a new dress and invite every single person she knew. I wanted Clara to walk into that grand ballroom feeling like an absolute queen. I wanted them to climb to the very highest peak of their arrogant delusion, because the higher they climbed, the more devastating the fall would be. I needed them surrounded by the exact people they were trying to impress when I finally ripped the mask off their faces. Julian began drafting the necessary corporate documents, coordinating with my private security team to ensure everything was perfectly aligned for the upcoming weekend. I spent the next few days forcing myself through agonizing physical therapy sessions, pushing my broken body to heal faster than the doctors thought possible. I needed to be able to walk without a cane. I needed to be able to wear heels. I needed to look like absolute perfection when I walked through the double doors of the Chateau Elite Club. The bruises on my face were slowly fading, replaced by a fierce, terrifying determination. I ordered a custom designer gown and the most expensive pair of Christian Louboutin heels I could find. I was going to walk into their celebration, not as the victim they discarded, but as the executioner they created. Every time the pain in my chest flared up, I just remembered the image of my mother throwing my life into a garbage bag. Every time my head throbbed, I remembered the sound of my sister's laughter as she twirled in my stolen clothes. Every time I felt tired, I remembered Preston's smug voice calling me a failure at the Thanksgiving table. The countdown had officially begun. 2 weeks of waiting had led to this exact moment. They were busy picking out floral arrangements and tasting champagne menus, completely oblivious to the massive storm gathering right above their heads. The party was set, the guests were invited, and the stolen money was spent. They thought they had won the ultimate prize. They thought they had finally defeated me. But the truth was they had just paid for the tickets to their own spectacular downfall, and I was going to make sure the entire world got a front row seat to the show. The preparations continued in absolute secrecy, while my body slowly regained its strength. Julian worked tirelessly behind the scenes, ensuring that my position as the majority shareholder of Vanguard Holdings was completely solidified and legally untouchable. Preston worked for Vanguard, and he believed his corporate title made him a god. He did not know that I had already purchased his entire company out from under him. He did not know that his job, his salary, and his entire professional reputation currently rested in the palm of my hand. I reviewed the corporate takeover documents, signing my name with a steady hand, feeling the immense power flowing through my veins. The trap was no longer just a possibility, it was an inescapable reality. As the weekend approached, I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my recovery room. The bandages were finally removed, leaving only faint shadows of the trauma I had survived. I looked at the woman in the reflection and promised her that she would never ever let anyone make her feel small again. The weak, desperate girl who begged for college tuition was completely gone. The silent daughter who swallowed insults at Thanksgiving was dead. The woman standing there now was a titan, a survivor, and a force of nature. I was ready to step out of the shadows and into the blinding light of their extravagant party. I was ready to take back everything they stole and burn their perfect fake world straight to the very ground. The stage was completely set for the ultimate reckoning. The Chateau Elite Club was bathed in the warm, glowing light of massive crystal chandeliers, as a live string quartet played a soft classical melody in the corner of the grand ballroom. It was exactly the kind of pretentious display of wealth that my mother Beatrice had always craved her entire life. The room was filled to the brim with Atlanta's high society. Corporate executives from Vanguard Holdings mingled effortlessly with the wealthy church ladies my mother desperately wanted to impress. Waiters in crisp white uniforms circulated through the massive crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with expensive vintage champagne and gourmet caviar. The walls were draped in rich velvet, and towering floral arrangements sat on every single table, filling the air with the heavy scent of roses and lilies. Every single drop of that champagne, every single flower in the lavish centerpieces, and every single note played by the musicians was paid for by my stolen money. Preston stood near the front of the room, playing the role of the perfect wealthy white savior to absolute perfection. He was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo, shaking hands with his senior corporate partners, and accepting their warm congratulations for a marriage milestone he was funding with first-degree felony wire fraud. Clara clung tightly to his arm, dripping in newly purchased diamonds that sparkled blindingly under the lights. She threw her head back and laughed loudly at a joke someone made, completely intoxicated by the illusion of her own elevated social status. They looked absolutely invincible. They looked exactly like people who firmly believed they had just successfully buried their biggest problem and gotten away with the perfect crime. The sheer confidence radiating from them was repulsive, knowing the dark, evil act they had committed just days prior to stand in this room. I watched all of this unfold through a secure live video feed on Julian's tablet, as we sat in the plush leather seats of my Rolls-Royce parked discreetly near the club entrance. The camera feed was tapped directly into the venue's internal security system, thanks to my private security team who had easily bypassed their basic firewalls. I wanted to wait for the exact right moment to strike. I wanted them to feel completely comfortable and victorious before I tore their fake world apart piece by piece. My ribs still ached terribly from the car crash, sending sharp jolts of pain through my chest whenever I breathed too deeply. But the physical pain was completely overshadowed by the pure raw adrenaline pumping through my veins. The anticipation was a powerful drug, masking every ache and replacing it with a burning desire for absolute justice. On the glowing screen, I saw my mother holding court near a massive ice sculpture carved into the shape of majestic swans. Beatrice was wearing a highly extravagant gown that screamed of new money, trying way too hard to fit in with the generational wealth of the room. She was surrounded by a group of older women she had spent her entire adult life trying to emulate and impress. They were sipping their stolen champagne and nodding sympathetically as my mother put on the dramatic performance of a lifetime. I asked Julian to turn up the volume on the tablet so I could hear the audio feed clearly through the hidden microphones my team had placed. One of the women, a wealthy socialite named Mrs. Holloway, leaned in and asked about me. She asked my mother how Ebony was doing after the terrible car crash she had heard whispers about in their social circles. My mother did not even blink or hesitate for a single second. She just let out a heavy, dramatic sigh and pressed a manicured hand to her chest, acting like a completely heartbroken parent bearing an unimaginable burden. "She is on her deathbed," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with fake sorrow and practiced grief. "The doctors say her life is completely ruined and she will never wake up from the coma. It is an absolute tragedy, but she always was a troubled girl who made poor choices and never listened to her family. Thankfully, we have Preston to hold us up during this incredibly dark time. He has been an absolute rock for us, providing everything we need and paying for all her medical bills out of the goodness of his massive heart." She lied with such incredible ease, it was almost fascinating to watch a master manipulator at work. She stood there drinking champagne paid for by the daughter she claimed was dying, and used my supposed tragedy to elevate her white son-in-law in the eyes of her wealthy peers. The ladies murmured their deep condolences, praising Preston for his immense generosity, and praising Beatrice for her maternal strength in the face of such sorrow. It was entirely sickening to witness. It was the absolute peak of their delusion and their greed. They were building a monument to their own vanity on top of what they thought was my literal grave, using my supposed death as a stepping stone to climb the social ladder they so desperately wanted to conquer. I looked at Julian and slowly nodded my head. It is time I told him, my voice steady and completely cold, devoid of any hesitation. I stepped out of the luxury vehicle into the cool night air of Atlanta. The pain in my healing body faded entirely into the background, replaced by the fierce energy of a woman ready to reclaim her stolen dignity. I smoothed down the fine fabric of my stunning emerald green evening gown. It was a custom-made masterpiece, fitting my body perfectly and hiding the faint outlines of the medical bandages still taped securely to my torso underneath the smooth silk. I slipped my feet into my red-bottom Christian Louboutin heels, feeling the familiar empowering lift they provided. The sharp stiletto heels clicked against the pavement like a ticking clock, counting down the final seconds of their fake reality. Tonight, I was not a victim seeking revenge. I was a force of nature delivering consequence. Julian walked a few paces behind me, carrying a heavy leather briefcase that contained the legal documents proving their total destruction. We approached the grand entrance of the Chateau Elite Club, where the valet drivers were busy parking expensive sports cars. The two large security guards standing at the front doors took one look at my posture, my designer gown, and the absolute cold fury radiating from my eyes, and they simply stepped aside without a word. They did not ask for an invitation or a name. People who walk with the conviction of someone who owns the building never get asked for an invitation. My presence commanded immediate, undeniable respect. We walked through this grand marble foyer, passing beautiful classical paintings and gilded mirrors, approaching the massive double oak doors of the main ballroom. I could hear the dull roar of laughter and lively conversation echoing on the other side of the thick wood, along with the gentle, sweeping notes of a cello. I took one final deep breath, filling my damaged lungs with air, and pushed the heavy doors open with both hands, using every ounce of strength I possessed. The heavy oak doors swung inward, with a loud dramatic thud that echoed sharply over the music of the string quartet. The immediate reaction was like a ripple moving quickly across a still pond. The guests standing nearest to the entrance turned their heads, annoyed at the interruption, to see who was arriving so late to the private invite-only event. When they saw me, their conversations stopped instantly, the words dying in their throats. The silence began to spread outward, moving through the crowded room like a sudden freezing drop in temperature sweeping from table to table. Within mere seconds, the low roar of the party completely died out, leaving only the sound of clinking silverware. Then even the professional string quartet faltered, with the cellist missing a glaring note before slowly lowering his bow as he stared blankly at the entrance. I was not in a hospital bed covered in tubes. I was not in a coma fighting for my life. I was not in a wheelchair, and I was certainly not on my deathbed. I stood at the top of the short carpeted staircase overlooking the lavish ballroom, looking so absolutely flawless and intimidating that the entire room collectively held its breath. The emerald gown caught the warm light from the crystal chandeliers, making me look radiant and powerful, and my makeup perfectly concealed the fading bruises on my cheekbones. I looked like a queen arriving to inspect her subjects and deliver a final devastating judgment upon the traitors in her court. I began to walk down the carpeted steps. The sharp, heavy click of my Louboutin heels sounded like gunshots in the dead silent room, slicing through the tension. The crowd naturally parted for me, stepping back hurriedly and clearing a wide path straight down the center of the ballroom floor. They stared in sheer shock, trying to comprehend how the woman they had just been told was dying was currently walking toward them with the terrifying grace of an apex predator. Guests whispered frantically to each other, covering their mouths in disbelief as I glided past their tables, leaving a wake of stunned silence behind me. My eyes locked intensely onto my family at the front of the room, ignoring everyone else. Clara was standing right next to the towering champagne fountain, showing off a diamond bracelet to a group of executives' wives. She had been taking a sip from her expensive crystal flute when the heavy doors first opened. As I walked closer to her, tracing a direct line to where she stood, the smug, entitled expression on her face literally melted away, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. Her eyes widened so much I thought they might pop out of her skull as her brain struggled to process the impossible sight before her. Her hands began to shake so violently that the expensive vintage wine spilled over the rim of the glass and splashed dark stains onto her pristine designer dress. She stared at me as if she was looking at a demon stepping straight out of a nightmare to drag her to hell. Her fingers went completely limp, losing all motor control. The crystal wine glass slipped from her trembling hand and shattered against the polished marble floor, sending sharp shards flying in every direction. The loud, sudden sound of the breaking glass echoed sharply through the massive room, emphasizing the total terrifying silence of the shocked guests. Preston was standing at the main podium at the front of the room, bathed in a spotlight. He had just tapped the microphone, preparing to give his grand anniversary speech to the elite crowd he wanted so desperately to impress. When his eyes finally found mine, moving through the crowd, his entire body completely froze, turning into a statue of pure dread. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin looking pale, sweaty, and sickly white, like a man who had just seen his own executioner. His mouth hung slightly open in a silent gasp of disbelief, and his hands gripped the edges of the wooden podium so tightly that his knuckles turned stark, glowing white. The arrogant corporate director who thought he had outsmarted a failed black woman was now trembling like a cornered animal, realizing he was caught in a lethal trap. He knew exactly what he had done, and seeing me walking, breathing, and radiating immense power meant he knew his terrible crime was no longer a secret. The $50,000 he stole was now a heavy federal chain wrapping tightly around his neck, pulling him down into the abyss. I kept walking, my steady, predatory gaze shifting smoothly to my mother. Beatrice turned around slowly, drawn by the sudden loud sound of her older daughter's shattered glass hitting the floor. When she saw me standing there in the flesh, her jaw dropped completely open, ruining her carefully applied makeup and perfectly practiced elegant facade. She took a clumsy, stumbling step backward in her high heels, bumping hard into Mrs. Holloway, the wealthy church friend she had just been lying to minutes before. The woman who had just played the tragic grieving mother to garner sympathy was now staring at me in absolute wide-eyed horror. She looked at my designer dress, my expensive shoes, and the fierce, unyielding power radiating from my perfect posture. This was not the broken, insecure daughter she had thrown out into the freezing rain 10 years ago. This was not the helpless victim she had abandoned in a cold hospital bed, hoping I would quietly pass away so she could steal my house. This was a woman who owned her world and was about to destroy theirs. I stopped perfectly in the center of the room, surrounded by hundreds of shocked, gaping guests. The silence was so incredibly heavy, it felt physically suffocating, pressing down on the chests of everyone present. Nobody dared to speak a single word or make a sudden movement, terrified of breaking the immense tension. The elite members of Atlanta society, the corporate executives, the wealthy socialites, they all watched in utter fascination and horror as the supposedly dead sister took absolute total control of the entire room without even saying a single word. I looked directly at my mother, my sister, and my brother-in-law, absorbing their fear like oxygen. They were completely trapped with no way out. They were surrounded by the very people they had desperately tried to impress, using my stolen money, making their impending humiliation absolute and inescapable. They could not run away, and they could not hide their faces from the glaring lights. The high society charade they had so carefully constructed over the past 2 weeks was cracking and splintering right before their very eyes, and I was fully prepared to bring the whole fake structure crashing down on their heads, reducing their lives to nothing but ash and regret. I did not break eye contact with Preston as I stood there in my emerald gown, letting the sheer weight of my survival crush his arrogant spirit. I let the silence stretch out for a long, agonizing moment, forcing them to marinate in their own escalating panic and guilt. Every second that passed felt like a full hour to them, a torturous eternity of waiting for the axe to fall. I could see the exact moment the harsh reality of their situation truly set in deep within their minds. They had maliciously forged legal medical documents. They had intentionally stolen a massive amount of money across state lines, committing a federal felony. They had cruelly left me for dead in a hospital room without a single tear. And now the dead woman had arrived to collect her dues in front of everyone they respected, ensuring their destruction would be witnessed by the entire city. Preston swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously as he desperately tried to find his voice, but his throat was completely dry. He looked around the room at his corporate bosses, at his wealthy friends, realizing that his perfect professional image and his freedom were in severe permanent jeopardy. He tried to force a fake, confident smile onto his pale, sweating face, trying to play off the massive shock to the crowd. But his eyes were darting rapidly around the room, looking for an exit that simply did not exist. Clara was still staring blindly at the broken glass at her feet, completely unable to lift her head to look at me directly, drowning in her own guilt and fear, while Beatrice remained frozen, completely speechless for the very first time in her entire miserable life. The trap had closed perfectly around them, sealing their fate with absolute certainty. They were standing on a lavish stage built entirely with my stolen funds, and the glaring spotlight was burning right through their pathetic lies, exposing the rotten core of their existence. The extravagant party was officially over, and the real reckoning, the public, unescapable destruction of their fake, perfect lives, was just about to begin, right there in the middle of the ballroom. The crushing silence in the grand ballroom was suddenly shattered by the sharp, frantic clicking of my mother's heels on the polished marble floor. Beatrice snapped out of her paralyzed state of shock, and her survival instincts kicked into high gear. She did not run toward me to pull me into a loving embrace. She did not fall to her knees, weeping tears of joy that her youngest daughter had miraculously survived a near-fatal car crash. Instead, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She marched across the room, closing the distance between us with aggressive, violent strides. She reached out and dug her manicured nails deeply into my bare arm, completely disregarding the fact that I was a recovering trauma patient. Her grip was desperate and punishing as she forcefully dragged me away from the center of the room. She pulled me toward a secluded, dimly lit alcove near the kitchen service doors, away from the prying eyes of the wealthy guests she so desperately wanted to impress. I let her pull me, my expression remaining entirely blank, because I wanted to see exactly how low she was willing to go to protect her fragile, fake empire. Once we were hidden behind a large velvet curtain, Beatrice turned on me like a cornered viper. She looked me up and down, taking in my expensive designer gown and my flawless appearance, but her mind completely rejected the reality sitting right in front of her. "You are not dead!" She hissed, her voice a venomous whisper, trembling with absolute fury. How dare you show your face here tonight of all nights and ruin your sister's special day? You are a selfish, evil girl, coming here to cause a massive scene just because you are jealous of Kiara and Preston. She was practically shaking with rage, her chest heaving as she glared at me with genuine hatred. There was not a single ounce of maternal relief in her eyes. She was only terrified that my sudden resurrection would somehow humiliate her in front of Atlanta high society. She firmly believed I was still the weak, pathetic girl who used to beg for her scraps of affection. She thought my silent stare was a sign of submission, but she was entirely wrong. It was the calm before the ultimate storm. Beatrice violently yanked open the clasp of her gaudy, heavily branded handbag. She reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of folded papers. She shoved them aggressively against my chest, hitting the exact spot where my fractured ribs were still painfully knitting together. The papers slipped from my lack of reaction and scattered across the expensive carpeted floor. They were the comprehensive medical invoices from the trauma center, the intensive care unit, and the surgical teams. They detailed hundreds of thousands of dollars in life-saving procedures. Here is your share. She spat at me, pointing a shaking finger at the documents on the floor. You pay it yourself. Do not even dream of draining a single cent from your sister's husband. Preston has already done more than enough for a failure like you by putting down the deposit for this beautiful party. You will not ruin their finances because you were too careless to drive properly. She stood there, breathing heavily, expecting me to crumble into tears and panic over the massive debt she had just thrown at my feet. She expected me to beg for her help and promised to leave quietly so I would not embarrass them further. I looked down at the scattered hospital bills resting by the tips of my red bottom heels. I did not cry. I did not tremble. I did not utter a single word in my own defense because a lion does not need to explain itself to a rat. I slowly raised my gaze back to her face, letting the absolute freezing cold emptiness in my eyes pierce straight through her delusions. The temperature in the small alcove seemed to drop rapidly as I simply stared at her, absorbing the sheer magnitude of her maternal betrayal. She had literally just told a woman recovering from near-fatal trauma to foot her own massive medical bills so her white son-in-law could continue pretending to be a wealthy socialite. It was the most repulsive display of narcissism I had ever witnessed, and it completely validated every single plan I had set in motion. I felt a profound sense of liberation washing over me. The woman standing in front of me was a complete stranger, and I owed her absolutely nothing. The general manager of the Chateau Elite Club had been hovering nervously near the velvet curtain, clearly unsure how to handle the sudden disruption of his most prestigious event. I turned my head slightly and gave him a single sharp nod. He immediately stepped into the alcove, standing at respectful attention. Beatrice looked at him and immediately tried to smooth out her angry expression, attempting to put her elegant mask back on. She opened her mouth, likely to apologize for my presence, and ask him to have security escort me off the premises. Before she could even form a single syllable, I reached into my sleek evening clutch. I smoothly pulled out a solid titanium American Express Centurion black card. It was heavy cold and represented a tier of unlimited generational wealth that my mother could not even begin to fathom. I held it between my index and middle finger and casually tossed it onto the small cocktail table next to us. The heavy metal card landed with a sharp, distinctive clink that echoed perfectly in the quiet alcove. "Settle the entire tab for this party right now," I instructed the manager, my voice completely smooth and dripping with absolute undeniable authority. "Pay for every single drop of champagne, every appetizer, and every floral arrangement in this building. Add a 50% gratuity for the waitstaff having to endure these miserable people." The manager immediately recognized the elite card, taking it with both hands and bowing deeply before rushing off to process the payment without a single question. I slowly turned my attention back to Beatrice. She was staring at the space where the card had just been, her eyes wide and her jaw practically unhinged. My hospital bills were already paid in full 3 weeks ago. I told her, my voice echoing with quiet, lethal power. My private insurance covered every single cent long before Preston ever walked into my hospital room with his pathetic forged documents. I let that truth sink into her greedy, panicked mind. She looked down at the medical bills scattered on the floor, and then back up to my face, trying desperately to compute how the daughter she had written off as a total failure was casually paying for an event that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars with a single piece of heavy metal. My mother stared at me in utter disbelief, her entire worldview shattering into millions of tiny, jagged pieces right before my eyes. She was looking at a symbol of wealth she had never seen in her entire pathetic life. A black card was an invitation-only status symbol reserved for billionaires, corporate titans, and global elites. It was not something a struggling dropout could ever possess. Her brain simply could not bridge the gap between the daughter she despised and the untouchable billionaire standing in front of her. Her hands began to shake, mirroring Kiara's panic from moments earlier. The realization that I was not a charity case, that I was not desperate for their help, and that I possessed a level of financial power that could easily buy and sell Preston's entire corporate career was slowly suffocating her. She opened her mouth, trying to formulate a sentence, trying to ask how this was even possible, but nothing came out except a weak, pathetic gasp of air. The glorious, unbreakable high society facade she had spent her entire life desperately trying to build was officially dead, and I had not even unleashed the main event yet. I left my mother standing completely frozen in that dark alcove. She was entirely paralyzed by the crushing weight of her own reality shattering into dust. I turned my back on her and walked smoothly back out into the bright, glaring lights of the grand ballroom. The atmosphere in the massive room had shifted dramatically during my brief absence. The wealthy guests were no longer laughing and sipping their expensive stolen champagne. They were whispering frantically behind their hands, casting nervous glances toward the front of the room. They could all smell the blood in the water, and the tension was absolutely suffocating. Preston had realized that the entire evening was slipping rapidly through his greedy fingers. He knew he had to do something drastic to regain control of the narrative before the elite crowd completely turned on him. I watched from the edge of the room as he practically sprinted up the short steps to the main stage. His face was covered in a thin layer of nervous sweat that glistened under the bright spotlights. He waved his hands wildly at the professional string quartet, signaling them to stop playing immediately. The sudden heavy silence that fell over the ballroom was incredibly uncomfortable. Preston gripped the sides of the wooden podium so hard his knuckles turned completely white. He forced his mouth into a wide, incredibly fake smile, trying desperately to project the image of a confident, successful man who was entirely in control of his domain. He tapped the microphone twice, sending a loud, echoing thud across the expansive room. He cleared his throat and projected his voice, attempting to sound like the benevolent patriarch of a flawless family. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate this wonderful anniversary with my beautiful wife, Clara," he began. His voice was shaking ever so slightly, but he pushed through the panic, trying to charm the wealthy executives and socialites staring up at him. "We are so incredibly blessed to be surrounded by such amazing friends and esteemed colleagues from Vanguard Holdings." He paused dramatically, looking out over the sea of faces, hoping to see validation and respect shining back at him. Then he smoothly shifted his focus right to the very topic he thought would save him. He put on a mask of deep, tragic sorrow, twisting his features into a pathetic display of fake empathy. He looked down at the floor for a second, acting like a man burdened by a terrible family tragedy. "As many of you witnessed earlier tonight, we had an unexpected and deeply troubling disruption," he said, his voice dripping with absolute poison masked as concern. "My sister-in-law, Ebony, is unfortunately suffering from severe mental instability. She was involved in a horrific car crash recently, and sadly, the trauma has left her with extensive brain damage and deep psychiatric delusions." The sheer audacity of his lies was almost impressive. He stood there in front of hundreds of people, looking them dead in the eyes, and completely rewrote reality to protect his own skin. He painted himself as the ultimate white savior, burdened with a crazy and dangerous black relative. "Our family is always forgiving and full of grace. Preston continued, leaning closer to the microphone to make sure every single person heard his ridiculous performance. We have tried everything to help her get the psychiatric care she desperately needs. We love her so much that we even set aside a large sum of our own personal money to pay for her funeral arrangements when the doctors told us she would not survive the week. We were fully prepared to handle her final expenses out of the goodness of our hearts. A collective murmur of sympathy rippled through the gullible crowd. The wealthy church ladies put their hands over their hearts, whispering to each other about what a wonderful and generous man Preston was. They were eating up every single word of his manipulative script, completely blind to the monster standing on the stage. Preston soaked up their validation like a dying man drinking water. His chest puffed out slightly, and his fake smile grew just a fraction more confident. He thought he had successfully neutralized the threat I posed by branding me as a brain-damaged lunatic whose words could never be trusted. Feeling deeply empowered by the crowd's sympathetic reaction, Preston decided to pivot to his ultimate goal for the evening. He wanted to remind the senior partners from his corporate firm exactly why he belonged in their elite ranks. He stood taller and completely dropped the sad act, replacing it with blinding corporate arrogance. "But tonight is not about tragedy," he announced, his voice booming through the speakers. "Tonight is about looking forward to a bright and incredibly successful future. I am extremely proud to announce to all my friends and family here that I have just received a massive promotion. As of this week, I am officially the new Senior Director of Regional Investments at Vanguard Holdings." He paused, waiting for the applause, and it came. The executives in the room clapped politely, raising their glasses to acknowledge his climb up the corporate ladder. Preston beamed under the lights, looking like a man who had just conquered the entire world. He talked about the millions of dollars he would be managing and the massive expansion projects he would be leading for the firm. He bragged about his financial acumen and his dedication to corporate excellence. He was frantically building a massive, impenetrable wall of status and privilege around himself, hoping that his shiny new title would protect him from the devastating truth I was holding in my hands. I stood quietly at the back of the ballroom, listening to every single pathetic, desperate lie falling from his mouth. My emerald green designer gown caught the ambient light as I finally stepped out of the shadows and began to walk straight down the center aisle of the room. The crowd parted for me once again, their eyes darting nervously between my calm, flawless face and Preston's sweating, panicked expression on the stage. My red bottom heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor, sounding like a steady, unrelenting drumbeat marching him straight toward his execution. Each step I took was a calculated strike against his fragile, bloated ego. I did not rush, and I did not slow down. I moved with the terrifying, fluid grace of a woman who possessed absolute, undeniable power over everything in the room. I reached the bottom of the short staircase leading up to the stage. Preston saw me coming, and the fake confident smile on his face completely collapsed. His eyes darted wildly toward the exits, looking for any possible escape route, but there was absolutely nowhere for him to run. He was trapped under the glaring spotlights, surrounded by the very people he had just lied to. I walked right up the stairs and stepped onto the stage, invading his personal space. He tried to hold his ground, trying to look intimidating, but his entire body was physically shaking. I could smell the sour stench of fear pouring off his skin. I reached out with a steady hand and snatched the heavy microphone directly out of his sweating fingers. He tried to hold on to it for a fraction of a second, but he was far too terrified to actually fight me for it. The microphone slid easily into my grasp. I turned my back on him, completely dismissing his presence, and faced the massive crowd of shocked, silent guests. I looked out over the sea of wealthy executives and high society elites, locking eyes with the senior partners from Vanguard Holdings who were sitting at a premium table near the front. I brought the microphone to my lips. My voice echoed through the grand ballroom, completely calm, entirely rational, and dripping with absolute lethal authority. "What an incredibly touching and generous speech, Preston," I said, letting the heavy sarcasm hang thick and biting in the cold air of the room. "It is truly inspiring to hear how much you care about family and corporate excellence." But you forgot to explain one tiny crucial detail to all your esteemed colleagues and friends gathered here tonight. You forgot to tell them exactly how you paid for this lavish, beautiful party. The silence in the room was so absolute, you could have heard a single pin drop on the carpet. I let the suspense stretch for a moment, watching the color drain completely out of Preston's face, out of the corner of my eye. You see, the $50,000 that Preston used to place the deposit for this exact country club ballroom was not earned through his hard work at Vanguard Holdings. I announced, my voice cutting through the room like a freshly sharpened blade. That $50,000 is money that Preston just stole directly from my personal bank account using a completely forged and fraudulent power of attorney. A loud collective gasp erupted from the crowd. The wealthy women who had just been pitying him a moment ago now stared at him with wide, horrified eyes. The senior partners from his corporate firm sat up entirely straight, their expressions turning incredibly dark and serious. I did not stop there. I leaned closer to the microphone, making sure every single syllable landed with devastating precision. He did not just steal this money. I continued, my voice rising with righteous, calculated anger. He walked into my hospital room while I was recovering from a near-fatal car crash. He stood over my broken body while I was on life support, and he forged my signature on legal documents intending to liquidate every single asset I own before I could wake up. He committed first-degree felony wire fraud and grand larceny across state lines, just so he could stand on this stage tonight and pretend to be a wealthy, successful man. He is nothing but a fraud, a thief, and a pathetic criminal who steals from injured Black women to fund his fake elite lifestyle. The reaction was explosive and instantaneous. The entire ballroom erupted into a chaotic frenzy of frantic whispers and loud, gasping conversations. The executives from Vanguard Holdings looked completely horrified and deeply disgusted, realizing they had just promoted a man who was actively committing massive federal crimes. People were pointing at Preston, whispering harshly to each other, completely tearing apart the perfect, pristine image he had spent years trying to build. The high society illusion was completely dead, completely shattered and rotting right there on the polished ballroom floor. Preston turned the color of spoiled milk. All the remaining blood drained rapidly from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified, sickly ghost caught in the blinding headlights of an oncoming train. His entire body was trembling so violently that he had to grab the edges of the podium just to keep himself from collapsing onto the stage. But his deeply ingrained arrogance and his desperate white privilege suddenly kicked into maximum overdrive. He absolutely refused to go down without a brutal fight. He was too proud and too delusional to accept that he had been completely defeated by someone he viewed as entirely inferior. He lunged forward, trying to snatch the microphone back from my hand, but I smoothly stepped out of his reach, keeping it firmly in my grasp. Denied the microphone, Preston resorted to screaming at the top of his lungs, trying to project his frantic voice over the loud, rising noise of the shocked crowd. "She is lying!" He roared, his face turning blotchy and bright red with pure desperation. "She is a complete liar and a psychopath. Do not listen to a single word she says. The car crash completely destroyed her brain. She is suffering from severe psychiatric delusions, and she is just trying to ruin my life because she is jealous of my success." He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger right at my face, looking out at his corporate bosses and begging them with his wide, panicked eyes to believe him. "Look at her!" he screamed frantically, waving his arms in the air like a madman losing his grip on reality. "She is crazy. She is a deeply disturbed individual who broke into this private event to harass my family. You cannot possibly believe the insane ramblings of a troubled Black woman over a respected senior director of your own company. I am a victim here. She is trying to extort me." He was banking everything on the deeply rooted societal biases of the room, hoping that the wealthy white executives would automatically side with one of their own rather than believe the harsh, brutal truth coming from my mouth. But the crowd did not immediately rally to his defense. They looked at my perfectly calm, composed posture, and then they looked at Preston, who was sweating profusely, spitting as he yelled, and looking completely unhinged. The contrast between my cold rational truth and his frantic sweating denial was absolutely striking. When the executives from his firm only stared back at him with cold, judgmental suspicion, Preston panicked completely. His survival instincts overrode any remaining shred of professional dignity he possessed. He spun around and started screaming frantically at the doors of the ballroom. "Security!" he yelled, his voice cracking with pure terror and rage. "Get security in here right now! Drag this crazy woman out of the building immediately. She is trespassing and making psychotic threats against my family. Remove her from this stage right this second." The four large security guards wearing crisp, dark suits who had been standing near the main entrance doors suddenly stepped forward into the room. They hesitated for a brief moment, looking down the long center aisle. They looked at me, standing tall, flawless, and completely unbothered at the podium, holding the microphone with total authority. Then they looked at Preston, who was sweating, screaming, and ordering them around like a frantic, cornered animal. The tension in the grand ballroom reached an absolute boiling point. As the guards slowly began to make their way toward the front of the room, their heavy footsteps adding to the chaotic noise. Preston continued to demand my immediate physical removal, his voice growing increasingly shrill and desperate as he tried to silence me before I could destroy whatever tiny, fragile pieces of his life he thought he still had left to save. The four large security guards continued their steady march down the center aisle of the grand ballroom, their dark suits cutting through the sea of terrified high society guests. They were moving with absolute purpose, ready to grab my arms and drag me out into the cold night, just like Preston had ordered. The heavy thud of their footsteps felt like a ticking clock, but I remained entirely unbothered. Before they could even reach the bottom of the stage steps, the loud, shrill sound of fake, hysterical sobbing pierced through the heavy tension of the room. Clara suddenly threw herself forward, rushing up the stairs and throwing her arms dramatically around Preston's trembling shoulders. She buried her face in his expensive tuxedo jacket, performing the role of the terrified, victimized wife with absolute theatrical perfection. Her diamond bracelets clinked against the microphone stand as she turned her head to face the crowd. Her eyes were perfectly wide and welling with forced tears that completely ruined her expensive designer makeup, leaving dark streaks of mascara running down her cheeks. "Do not listen to a single word she says," Clara cried out, her voice shaking with practiced vulnerability and manipulative panic. "Please, you all have to understand, my poor sister was in a horrific car crash just a few weeks ago. She suffered massive, irreversible brain damage, and she has completely lost her mind. She went completely crazy after the accident, and she does not know what she is saying." She pointed a shaking, dramatic finger at me, trying to paint me as a deranged monster who had broken into her perfect fairy tale life to cause baseless destruction. "She has always been deeply jealous of my beautiful marriage and my incredible success," Clara wailed to the audience, clinging tighter to Preston. "She is just a bitter, struggling woman who cannot handle the fact that Preston and I have a perfect life while she has absolutely nothing. She is making up these insane criminal allegations because her broken mind cannot process her own tragic failures." My mother Beatrice saw the tiny window of opportunity opening up, and she immediately lunged right through it. She rushed to the front of the stage, positioning herself as the noble, heartbroken matriarch trying to protect her wealthy white son-in-law from a madwoman. She looked out at the wealthy church ladies and the corporate executives she had spent the whole evening trying to impress. Her face was twisted into a masterful mask of fake maternal agony. "It is true!" Beatrice wailed loudly, clasping her hands together in a desperate, dramatic plea for sympathy. "My youngest daughter is severely mentally ill. The trauma from the crash completely destroyed her fragile mind, and she has been suffering from violent hallucinations. She ran away from the hospice facility, and now she is making up these horrible psychotic lies to ruin this beautiful anniversary party." Beatrice squeezed out a few fake tears, wiping them away delicately so as not to ruin her own makeup. "We have tried so hard to help her, but she is beyond saving," Beatrice cried out, playing the devastated mother to absolute perfection. Then Beatrice turned her furious, glaring eyes toward the security guards who had paused at the edge of the stage. "What are you waiting for?" she demanded, her voice dropping the fake sorrow and turning vicious and commanding. "Grab her right now. She is a dangerous liability to herself and everyone in this elegant room. Tie her up if you have to, just get her out of my sight before she hurts someone or destroys anything else." The guards hesitated for a fraction of a second, but the loud, commanding tone of an older, wealthy-looking woman gave them the final push they needed. They began to step up onto the stage, reaching their massive hands out to grab my arms and silence my truth forever. I stood perfectly still behind the wooden podium, not taking a single step backward. I did not flinch, and I did not break my calm, icy stare. The wealthy guests in the grand ballroom began to whisper frantically among themselves, leaning in close to each other behind their expensive crystal champagne flutes. The deeply ingrained societal programming of the elite room was slowly starting to work in Preston's favor. It was incredibly easy for them to believe the narrative of an angry, jealous, and mentally unstable black woman trying to blindly tear down a successful white corporate director. They desperately wanted to believe Kiara's fake tears and Beatrice's dramatic performance because it was much easier to accept a crazy sister than to admit they were currently rubbing elbows with a ruthless federal criminal who had stolen money from a dying relative. Preston felt the momentum in the room shifting, and his chest puffed out with a sudden sickening surge of renewed arrogant confidence. The color slowly started returning to his pale, sweating face. He glared at me with a victorious, sinister smirk, silently telling me that his corporate privilege and his pristine social standing formed an impenetrable shield that my raw truth could never break. He truly believed he had won the war. He thought the security guards would violently drag me out the heavy oak doors, and he would simply return to drinking stolen champagne with his elite friends while I was thrown into a psychiatric ward. He was so deeply consumed by his own arrogance that he never even considered the possibility that I was holding the ultimate trump card. Just as the largest security guard reached his heavy hand out to grab my bare shoulder, intending to forcefully pull me away from the microphone, a sudden massive sound echoed from the very back of the ballroom. The heavy double oak doors of the Chateau Elite Club swung open again, hitting the interior walls with a deafening, violent crash that physically shook the room and vibrated through the floorboards. The sheer explosive force of the entrance made every single person in the massive space turn their heads, entirely abandoning the intense drama playing out on the stage. The security guards completely froze, dropping their hands and looking toward the back of the room with wide eyes. Walking through the doorway, with the terrifying precision of a legal executioner, was Julian, my lead corporate attorney. He was dressed in an immaculate, custom-tailored charcoal gray suit, carrying a thick black leather briefcase that looked heavy enough to hold a lifetime of secrets. But Julian was not alone. Walking firmly and purposely on either side of him were two tall, broad-shouldered detectives. They were wearing dark tactical windbreakers, with the bright yellow letters of the Financial Crimes Division printed clearly across their backs. The cold, hard reality of federal law enforcement entering the room instantly and violently shattered the fake high society illusion Preston had desperately tried to rebuild just seconds before. Julian and the two federal detectives marched straight down the center aisle, their heavy boots pounding a rhythmic, terrifying beat against the polished marble floor. The crowd of wealthy executives and socialites scrambled frantically out of their way, backing into the catering tables and knocking over expensive crystal glasses in their absolute blind panic. Nobody dared to speak a single word or even breathe too loudly as the crushing weight of federal authority moved swiftly through the opulent room. Preston watched them approach, and his entire body deflated like a punctured balloon, rapidly losing all its air. The smug, victorious smirk vanished from his sweating face, instantly replaced by a look of raw, unadulterated, primitive panic. His eyes darted from the detectives to the heavy briefcase Julian carried, knowing deep down that his lies were no longer enough to save him. Kiara stopped her fake theatrical sobbing completely, her mouth hanging wide open as she stared directly at the glowing gold badges clipped securely to the detectives' belts. The fake tears dried instantly on her face, replaced by genuine, paralyzing fear. Beatrice took a heavy stumbling step backward, clutching her chest as her perfectly crafted web of lies began to crumble into fine dust. Julian did not even look at the bewildered security guards as he reached the stage. He simply walked right past them, stepping up to the podium and standing firmly by my side, projecting an aura of absolute impenetrable legal protection. The two detectives positioned themselves at the base of the stairs silently and efficiently, cutting off any possible escape route Preston might try to take in his desperation. Julian set his heavy leather briefcase down on the wooden podium right next to my hands, letting the loud thud echo through the silent room. He popped the metal latches open with a loud, sharp click that sounded exactly like a lock snapping shut on a cold prison cell. He reached inside the briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legal documents stamped prominently with official blue and red federal seals. He turned slowly to face the massive crowd of terrified guests and spoke with a booming, authoritative voice that carried effortlessly to the very back of the room. "My client, Mrs. Ebony, is entirely sane," Julian announced, holding the thick medical and legal file high in the air for every single person to clearly see. "She has been thoroughly evaluated by top medical professionals, and her cognitive functions are absolutely flawless. The only people in this room suffering from dangerous, severe delusions are the ones desperately trying to have her thrown out to cover up their own massive crimes." Julian turned his piercing, unforgiving gaze directly onto Preston, who was now visibly shaking so hard his knees were literally knocking together under his expensive tailored trousers. "And Mr. Preston?" Julian continued, his voice dripping with lethal legal precision and absolute disgust. "That luxury Buckhead mansion you tried to illegally sell this morning using a pathetically forged power of attorney is not just some random lucky house belonging to a struggling woman." The entire ballroom was dead silent, waiting for the final crushing blow that would rewrite reality. The senior partners from Vanguard Holdings leaned forward in their chairs, their faces pale with dawning horror, as they realized their newly promoted director was tangled in a web of massive federal fraud. Julian lowered the heavy file and looked directly at the Vanguard executives, making sure they heard every single word of his next sentence. "That specific Buckhead property," Julian announced clearly and loudly, "is actually just one of 45 ultra-luxury commercial and residential properties owned outright by the E Holdings Group." He paused, letting the massive weight of that specific corporate name sink deeply into the minds of the financial elites gathered in the room. They all knew exactly what the E Holdings Group was. It was one of the most aggressive, powerful, and insanely wealthy private equity firms in the entire Southeast, known for ruthless acquisitions and massive capital control. The executives' eyes widened in absolute shock as their brains struggled to connect the impossible dots between the supposedly crazy black woman on the stage and the faceless corporate giant they all deeply feared and respected. "And Mrs. Ebony, standing right here before you," Julian concluded smoothly, turning to gesture toward me, "is the sole founder and current chairwoman of that multi-billion-dollar empire." The collective gasp that ripped through the grand ballroom was loud enough to rattle the delicate crystal chandeliers hanging from the high ceiling. The sheer magnitude of the revelation hit the crowd like a massive seismic shockwave, completely obliterating every single lie my family had ever told about me over the last decade. The deeply ingrained narrative of the pathetic, ugly college dropout, the completely fabricated story of the jealous, crazy sister, the fake tragedy of a failed black woman who needed her white brother-in-law to save her. It all vanished into thin air, instantly incinerated by the blinding light of my actual magnificent reality. I was not a tragic charity case, and I was certainly not a helpless victim begging for scraps of love. I was a corporate titan who literally owned the very ground they were standing on and possessed enough capital to buy their entire lives 10 times over. The executives from Preston's firm were staring at me with a mixture of profound terror and deep professional respect, realizing they had just witnessed the most ruthless display of corporate power they had ever seen in their entire careers. The high society church friends who had just been pitying me were now staring at my custom emerald gown and my glowing skin, realizing they had been entirely fooled by a family of pathetic, greedy parasites I slowly turned my head to look directly at my mother. Beatrice was staring at me as if the sky had just ripped violently open and swallowed the entire earth. The sheer magnitude of the immense wealth and absolute power Julian had just announced was completely and utterly breaking her fragile narcissistic mind. She had spent my entire life calling me a profound disappointment. She had thrown me out into the freezing rain because she genuinely thought I would never amount to anything more than a lowly employee. She had literally wished for my death just hours ago so she could steal a single house and a car to maintain her fake affluent lifestyle. And now she was standing in front of hundreds of the most important people in her social circle, realizing that the daughter she maliciously threw away was worth billions of dollars. Her trembling legs simply gave out completely, refusing to hold up the weight of her colossal catastrophic mistake. Beatrice collapsed backward, falling heavily and awkwardly into a padded velvet chair behind her. She sat there gasping for air like a fish out of water, her eyes wide and entirely vacant, completely unable to believe her own ears. The glamorous fake world she had sacrificed her own flesh and blood to build was utterly gone, forever crushed completely under the heel of my red-bottom shoes, leaving her with absolutely nothing but the crushing reality of her own monumental failure as a mother and as a human being. The heavy presence of the financial crimes detectives completely shifted the power dynamic in the grand ballroom. The security guards who had been marching toward me immediately backed away, raising their hands in a gesture of absolute surrender. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with a federal investigation. Preston stood on the stage watching his physical protection evaporate into thin air. The sheer terror that had gripped him just moments ago slowly began to mutate into something entirely different. It twisted into a deeply ingrained, toxic arrogance. He was a wealthy white male executive who had spent his entire life failing upward, protected by a system designed to shield him from any real consequences. Even now, backed into a corner with federal detectives blocking his exit, he simply could not fathom a reality where a black woman could actually defeat him. He straightened his posture, smoothing the lapels of his expensive custom tuxedo, trying to project an aura of untouchable corporate authority. The panic in his eyes was replaced by a cold, malicious sneer as he looked down at me from the elevated stage. "You really think you can fight me, Ebony?" Preston spat, his voice echoing through the silent ballroom without the need for a microphone. He took a step forward, pointing an aggressive finger in my direction. "You are nothing but a lucky brat who stumbled into some money. You think bringing a couple of cops here is going to scare me? You have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with. I am a senior director at Vanguard Holdings. I manage billions of dollars for the most powerful people in this state. My corporate legal team will completely crush your little company before you can even file a single piece of paperwork. We will drag you through civil litigation for decades. We will freeze every single asset you think you have, and we will bankrupt you until you are begging on the streets. You are going to lose everything, you pathetic failure." He stood there breathing heavily, completely intoxicated by his own delusional sense of superiority. He firmly believed that his corporate title and his proximity to institutional white wealth made him invincible. He looked at the executives from Vanguard Holdings who were sitting in the front row, expecting them to nod in agreement and rally behind his aggressive threats. He thought they would protect him simply because he wore the same corporate uniform. Listening to his arrogant, pathetic rant triggered a vivid, crushing memory from my early 20s. It was a memory that perfectly encapsulated the exact toxic dynamic my family had worshipped for years. I was 22 years old, working 3 exhausting jobs to save up a small nest egg for my future. I had managed to save exactly $12,000. It was blood money earned through sleepless nights, scrubbing floors, and dealing with abusive customers. I had kept it hidden in a basic savings account, dreaming of using it to start my own small business. But my mother Beatrice found the bank statements hidden in my bedroom. Instead of being proud of my incredible work ethic, she immediately called a family meeting. She forced me to sit in the living room while Preston, who had just started his entry-level job at Vanguard Holdings, sat in the large leather armchair like a visiting king. Beatrice demanded that I hand over my entire life savings to Preston so he could invest it in a supposedly guaranteed corporate portfolio. She looked at me with absolute disgust, telling me that I was too stupid and too financially illiterate to manage my own money. "Look at him, Ebony," my mother had said, pointing at Preston, who was wearing a cheap, shiny suit. "He works at Vanguard Holdings. He is a professional white man in corporate finance. He understands how the real world works. You are just a clueless girl making minimum wage. Give him the money so he can secure a future for the family, because you certainly will not." I had cried and begged them to let me keep my hard-earned money. I tried to explain my business plan, but Preston just laughed right in my face. He told me my ideas were completely worthless and that a black woman with no degree had absolutely zero chance of succeeding in the real world. He promised to double my money in 6 months using his elite corporate connections. The pressure from my mother and sister was so intense and so suffocating that I eventually broke down and transferred the funds to Preston's account. It took him exactly 3 weeks to lose every single penny on a highly speculative, high-risk day trade that he had researched on an internet forum. When I found out my money was gone, I was completely devastated. I confronted Preston, demanding an explanation. He did not apologize. He did not offer to pay me back. He simply shrugged his shoulders and told me that the market was volatile and I should have known the risks. When I went to my mother for help, expecting her to hold her precious son-in-law accountable, she completely turned on me. She blamed me for putting too much pressure on him and told me to stop being so dramatic over a few $1,000s. They protected his fragile ego over my literal survival, all because he carried a business card from Vanguard Holdings. They worshipped his title and his skin color, treating his massive failures as minor accidents, while treating my mere existence as a severe disappointment. That specific memory had burned like acid in my chest for years. It was the exact moment I realized that my family would gladly watch me starve to death as long as Preston remained comfortable. I remembered how Beatrice had paraded Preston around our neighborhood after he got that entry-level job at Vanguard. She threw a massive backyard barbecue, inviting all her friends just to casually mention that her daughter had married a finance man. She bought him expensive gifts using money she claimed she did not have when I needed to buy groceries. She treated him like a deity who had descended from the heavens to bless our unworthy family with his presence. Every single achievement I ever had was immediately completely overshadowed by whatever mundane task Preston had completed at the office that week. If I scored a new client for my freelance design work, my mother would instantly change the subject to Preston's new office chair. If I managed to save enough money to buy a reliable used car, Clara would loudly mock me while Preston tossed the keys to his least luxury sedan on the kitchen counter. They fed his ego constantly, creating a monster of pure entitlement who truly believed the world owed him everything he desired. But standing in the grand ballroom tonight, listening to him use that exact same corporate title as a weapon against me, the memory no longer caused me any pain. It only highlighted the absolute hilarious irony of his current situation. He was trying to use Vanguard Holdings to terrify a woman who had just spent the last 5 years destroying companies twice that size. He was threatening me with a legal team that I could easily buy and sell before breakfast. That same entitlement was radiating from him right now on the stage of the Chateau Elite Club. He was clinging to the name Vanguard Holdings as if it were a magical spell that could make the police detectives disappear and turn my billions of dollars back into dust. He was a pathetic small man, hiding behind the logo of a massive corporation, blindly trusting that the systemic privilege he had enjoyed his entire life would automatically protect him from the consequences of stealing from a black woman. I remained perfectly still at the bottom of the stage steps, letting his pathetic threats echo and die in the massive room. The wealthy guests watched in absolute stunned silence, waiting to see how I would react to his aggressive corporate posturing. They expected me to flinch. They expected me to yell back or show some sign of intimidation. Instead, I slowly and deliberately crossed my arms over the smooth silk of my emerald green evening gown. I tilted my head slightly, observing him with the detached clinical interest of a scientist studying a particularly repulsive insect. My posture was entirely relaxed, completely devoid of any fear or hesitation. I watched him flail under the bright spotlights. His chest was heaving. His face was red and blotchy, and his hands were gripping the wooden podium so hard his fingers looked like they might snap. He was a drowning man, screaming at the ocean, demanding that the waves stop crashing over his head. The sheer desperation in his voice was the sweetest music I had ever heard. I let him run out of breath, allowing the heavy, suffocating silence to press down on his shoulders once again. The Vanguard executives in the front row were no longer clapping or smiling. The regional vice president, a stern older man with silver hair, was staring at Preston with a look of absolute sheer disgust. He had just realized that the man he had promoted earlier that week was not a rising star, but a massive, catastrophic liability. The corporate world does not forgive public humiliation, and Preston was currently creating the largest public relations disaster in the history of their firm. The executives were already subtly pulling out their cell phones, quietly drafting urgent emails to their crisis management teams, completely abandoning Preston to the wolves. They were cutting the dead weight loose before the ship even began to sink. I watched Preston desperately search their faces for any sign of support, but he found only cold corporate indifference. His safety net was completely gone. The wealthy church ladies who had praised him earlier were now clutching their pearls and whispering harsh judgments about his criminal behavior. The elite society he had stolen my money to impress was actively turning their backs on him, treating him like a diseased animal that had wandered into their pristine ballroom. The isolation he was feeling right now was the exact same isolation he and my family had forced upon me for an entire decade. But the massive difference was that I had used my isolation to build an impenetrable fortress of wealth and power, while he had used his privilege to build a fragile house of cards that was currently collapsing under the weight of his own monumental stupidity. "You seem very proud of Vanguard Holdings. Do you not, Preston?" I asked, my voice smooth, calm, and completely terrifying. The question floated softly through the room, a stark contrast to his loud, aggressive screaming. "You wear that corporate title like a suit of armor, believing it makes you untouchable. You honestly think that working for a powerful financial institution gives you the absolute right to steal, to forge legal documents, and to threaten the very people you tried to murder." Preston swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his tight tuxedo collar. He did not know how to respond to my total lack of fear. He expected a fight, but he was facing a brick wall of absolute certainty. "Yes, I am proud," he stammered, trying to regain his aggressive footing, but failing miserably. "Vanguard is a global powerhouse. We destroy people like you every single day. You're making a massive mistake, Ebony. You should have just stayed in your lane." I let a small, razor-sharp smile touch the corners of my lips. The sheer magnitude of his ignorance was almost beautiful. He was standing on a trapdoor that had already opened, and he was just waiting for gravity to pull him down into the darkness. I uncrossed my arms and slowly turned my head to look at Julian, who was standing patiently by my side. Julian's face was completely blank, a perfect mask of legal professionalism, but I could see the fierce anticipation burning in his dark eyes. He had worked tirelessly with me for months to set up this exact sequence of events. I took a step closer to the stage. The silk of my dress flowed smoothly around my legs. I stood firmly anchored to the floor, a physical manifestation of the long, brutal journey I had taken from the freezing rain to the top of the financial world. I was no longer the vulnerable 19-year-old girl begging for her own money. I was the architect of their destruction, and I was enjoying every single second of their escalating panic. "You really should have done your research, Preston," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous volume that forced the entire room to lean in just to hear me. "You spent so much time practicing my signature on those forged documents, but you never bothered to look into the corporate structure of the company you worship so much. You were so blinded by your own greed that you failed to see the massive shadow moving right over your head. You thought you were the smartest person in the room simply because you were the loudest. But the loudest people in the room are always the easiest targets to eliminate. It is truly fascinating how much faith you place in an institution without knowing anything about its actual foundation, I said, turning my gaze back to Preston. You threaten me with a corporate legal team, but you fail to understand the most basic fundamental rule of finance. The people who work for the company do not hold the real power, Preston. The people who own the company hold the power. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the air fill my lungs completely. The sharp pain in my fractured ribs was nothing compared to the absolute, overwhelming rush of victory preparing to wash over me. The executives from Vanguard Holdings sitting in the front row suddenly looked extremely nervous, shifting uncomfortably in their seats and exchanging worried glances. They knew something was terribly wrong. They could sense the massive shift in the atmosphere, and they were beginning to realize that the woman standing in front of them was holding a card that could destroy their entire corporate structure. Preston opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. His throat moved convulsively as he tried to swallow the massive lump of terror blocking his airway. His hands slowly slid off the wooden podium, his legs shaking so badly he looked like he might collapse onto the stage at any given moment. Clara had completely stopped crying, now staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated horror as she finally realized that the sister she had mocked and tormented her entire life was completely out of her reach forever. Beatrice remained slumped in her velvet chair, staring blankly at the crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling. The reality of her colossal failure was completely short-circuiting her brain. She had chosen to protect a criminal son-in-law over her own biological daughter, and that choice had just destroyed everything she had ever cared about. Her social standing, her reputation, her access to wealth. It was all entirely gone, burned to ashes by the blinding truth I had brought into the room. I turned my attention fully to Julian, maintaining absolute silence for another long, agonizing moment. The tension in the grand ballroom was stretched so tight it felt like the crystal chandeliers might shatter from the pressure alone. Preston was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically between me and the heavy leather briefcase resting on the podium. I looked at the two federal detectives standing quietly at the base of the stairs, their presence a solid, undeniable guarantee that Preston's future would be spent behind cold iron bars. The entire room was holding its collective breath, waiting for the final crushing blow. I nodded my head once, a single sharp, decisive movement that signaled the absolute end of Preston's miserable, arrogant existence. "Open the final briefcase, Julian," I commanded, my voice ringing with total, absolute authority. Julian reached into his open leather briefcase with calm, methodical precision. Every single person in the grand ballroom held their breath as the rustle of official papers echoed clearly through the quiet room. Preston watched Julian's hands with wide, bloodshot eyes trembling so violently that he had to hold on to the edge of the stage wall just to remain standing. Clara stood frozen beside him, her hands pressed against her mouth as cold sweat ran down her neck. Beatrice sat slumped in her velvet chair, staring blankly forward, as if her brain had completely given up on trying to process the nightmare unfolding around her. Julian pulled out a thick legal document encased in a heavy blue executive folder. Affixed to the front cover was a raised red corporate seal that gleamed under the warm light of the crystal chandeliers. He did not hand it to Preston directly. Instead, he walked slowly to the edge of the podium and dropped the heavy document onto the wooden surface right in front of Preston's shaking hands. The sharp, loud thud of the folder hitting the wood sounded like a gavel slamming down to mark the end of a trial. Preston stared at the red seal as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. His eyes darted from the paper up to my face and then back down again, refusing to accept what his mind was desperately trying to deny. "You are a financial director, Preston," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy air with razor-sharp clarity and absolute cold composure. "Yet you do not even bother to read your own firm's quarterly shareholder reports. Did you honestly not check who was behind the private equity firm that acquired 60% of Vanguard Holdings last month?" A sharp collective gasp erupted from the front row where the senior executives of Vanguard Holdings were seated. The regional vice president sat up straight, his mouth opening in complete utter shock as the pieces of the puzzle finally fell into place. He looked at me with dawning horror and profound professional realization. The room seemed to tilt on its axis as the high society guests gasped, whispering frantically to one another as the sheer weight of my statement crashed over them. I stepped forward, invading Preston's space until I was looking him dead in his panicked, sweating eyes. My voice resonated through the entire ballroom, completely devoid of pity. "Welcome to reality, Preston," I said, letting every single word land like a heavy sledgehammer against his fragile, bloated ego. "I am your new chairwoman of the board, and your termination order for embezzlement, grand larceny, and corporate fraud was signed by me right from my hospital bed last night." The entire grand ballroom was paralyzed in absolute horror. The atmosphere turned completely ice-cold. A wave of audible gasps swept through the hundreds of elite guests like a sudden gust of wind. People covered their mouths in sheer disbelief, while executives from competing firms stared at the stage with wide, unblinking eyes. The illusion was completely dead. The white privilege, the corporate title, the arrogant posturing, it all dissolved into useless, worthless dust in a single fraction of a second. Preston looked down at the document with trembling fingers. His eyes scanned the signature line at the bottom of the board resolution. There, stamped in official corporate ink alongside the seal of E Holdings, was my signature. The exact same name he had spent weeks forging on a fake power of attorney was now written legally at the top of his former company. His face turned a sickening shade of gray. His breath came in short, ragged gasps as his chest heaved under his tailored tuxedo jacket. His entire body began to shake uncontrollably. His knees completely buckled beneath him, losing all strength as the crushing reality of his total, absolute ruin slammed into his chest. Preston collapsed heavily onto his knees right there on the stage floor. He looked small, pathetic, and entirely broken, kneeling at the feet of the woman he had called a failure just minutes before. Clara let out a strangled, horrific shriek as she watched her husband fall. She reached out to grab him, but her own hands were shaking too badly to hold his weight. She looked up at me, her face twisted in pure primitive panic, realizing that the lifestyle she had bragged about, the house, the cars, the status, were all vanishing before her eyes. Beatrice sat entirely motionless in her chair, her eyes wide and glassy, as the high society friends she had spent her life trying to impress turned away from her in complete disgust. I stood over Preston at the podium, looking down at his trembling form with total cold detachment. The entire room was dead silent, watching the ultimate collapse of a man who had built his life on arrogance, greed, and stolen dreams. The two federal detectives did not waste another second. They stepped forward, moving in perfect synchronization, up the short wooden stairs to the stage. The sound of their heavy tactical boots thudding against the floorboards broke the paralyzing spell that had fallen over the grand ballroom. They approached Preston, who was still kneeling weakly on the ground, his face buried in his trembling hands. The taller detective reached down and grabbed Preston by the shoulder of his expensive custom tuxedo, violently jerking him upward until he was forced to stand on his own two shaking feet. Preston stumbled, his legs completely failing him, but the detective held him firmly in place. "Preston, you are under arrest for first-degree felony, wire fraud, grand larceny, and corporate embezzlement," the detective announced, his deep voice projecting clearly across the silent room. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." Preston tried to speak, tried to form a coherent sentence of defense, but his mouth just opened and closed uselessly. The detective roughly grabbed Preston's arms, pulling them tightly behind his back. The harsh metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed through the microphone that was still resting on the podium. It was the ultimate sound of total, absolute finality. The wealthy elite guests, who had been drinking his stolen champagne just 20 minutes ago, now physically recoiled from the stage, pulling their designer dresses and expensive suits away, as if Preston had suddenly caught a highly contagious, deadly disease. The senior partners from Vanguard Holdings were already furiously typing on their phones, initiating emergency damage control to completely erase his name from their corporate history. Preston was officially a ghost. A disgraced criminal being paraded in front of the exact high society he had sold his soul to impress. As the detectives began to march Preston down the stage steps, the reality of the situation finally penetrated the thick wall of delusion surrounding Clara. The shiny diamonds on her wrists suddenly felt like heavy lead weights. The massive, expensive house she thought she had stolen from me was gone. The luxury cars were gone. The elite social status she craved more than oxygen was completely obliterated. She was about to be the wife of a convicted federal felon, drowning in massive legal debt, and entirely shunned by the wealthy church friends she so desperately wanted to lead. Clara let out a loud, guttural scream that tore through her throat. She scrambled frantically up the stage stairs, her high heels catching on the carpet, causing her to stumble and fall to her knees right in front of me. She did not care about her ruined designer dress or the fact that hundreds of people were watching her complete mental collapse. She lunged forward, grabbing onto my bare arm with desperate, sweating fingers. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into my skin, but I did not flinch or pull away. I just stared down at her, watching the pathetic, frantic tears streaming down her ruined face. "Ebony, please, you cannot do this to us!" Clara wailed loudly, her voice cracking with pure, raw panic. "Please tell them to stop. Tell them it was all a terrible misunderstanding. He is your brother-in-law. We are your family. You cannot send him to federal prison. We will lose everything. We will be completely ruined. Please have mercy on us, Ebony. You have so much money you do not even need that $50,000. Just let it go for the sake of the family." I looked down at my older sister, listening to the absolute ridiculous hypocrisy pouring out of her mouth. She was begging for mercy using the exact same word, family, that she had completely disregarded when she marched into my hospital room, aiming to pull my life support. I remembered the vivid, horrific footage from my hidden security cameras. I remembered watching her dance joyfully in my bedroom, twirling around in my expensive silk gowns and laughing gleefully at the thought of my imminent death. She had celebrated my demise with a glass of stolen vintage wine, and now she was weeping on the floor, begging me to save her fake, pathetic lifestyle. She did not care about me or my survival. She only cared that her personal ATM machine was currently being escorted out the front doors in iron shackles. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of Kiara's begging, a sudden violent movement caught my attention from the corner of my eye. My mother, Beatrice, who had been sitting frozen and paralyzed in her velvet chair, suddenly snapped out of her catatonic shock. Her survival instincts, which had always been exceptionally ruthless, kicked into maximum overdrive. She saw her golden child completely destroyed, and she saw her white knight son-in-law being hauled off to a federal penitentiary. But more importantly, she saw the absolute, undeniable reality of my multi-billion-dollar empire standing right in front of her. She saw the ultimate prize. Beatrice pushed herself up from the chair, nearly knocking over a small cocktail table in her frantic haste. She shoved her way past the wealthy socialites she had been trying to impress, completely abandoning her elegant, dignified facade. She scrambled up the stage steps, breathing heavily, her eyes wide and glowing with a terrifying, manic desperation. She practically shoved Clara out of the way, kicking her own favorite daughter to the side, just to get closer to the real source of ultimate wealth and power. Beatrice reached out and aggressively grabbed both of my hands, gripping them so tightly it actually hurt my knuckles. Her face twisted into the most bizarre, grotesque mask of fake maternal affection and dramatic sorrow I had ever seen in my entire life. Tears began to well up in her eyes, perfectly timed and expertly executed. "Ebony! My beautiful, brilliant daughter," Beatrice cried out, her voice projecting loudly enough for the remaining crowd to hear. I knew it. I always absolutely knew it. I always knew my biological flesh and blood was the most intelligent, talented woman in the world. I knew you were destined for absolute greatness from the very moment you were born. I stared at her, completely paralyzed by the sheer repulsive magnitude of her instant, total psychological flip. This was the exact same woman who had thrown a stack of hospital bills at my chest just 20 minutes ago, telling me to pay for my own death. This was the woman who had violently swept my entire life into black trash bags, complaining about the dust on my picture frames. And now she was holding my hands, looking at me with feigned absolute adoration, as if I were the center of her entire universe. "You have to understand, Ebony," Beatrice wailed loudly, squeezing my hands tighter and pulling them close to her chest. "Everything I ever did to you, every harsh word, every single time I pushed you away, it was all just a test. I was only pretending to be cruel to you. I had to be hard on you because I needed to motivate you to succeed. I knew that if I babied you, you would never reach your true potential. I broke my own heart just to make you strong. It was all tough love, my sweet girl. It was all for you." She looked deep into my eyes, trying desperately to find the vulnerable, desperate 19-year-old girl who used to beg for her approval. She thought she could just hit a massive reset button and rewrite 30 years of systemic emotional abuse simply because she had finally realized my net worth. She truly believed she could manipulate her way into my bank accounts by playing the role of the tough but loving matriarch who had secretly orchestrated my massive success from the very beginning. "Please forgive Mommy," Beatrice sobbed dramatically, dropping to her knees right next to where Clara was still weeping on the floor. "Please forgive me for being so hard on you. You have proven yourself beyond my wildest dreams. You won the ultimate test, Ebony. Now please use your incredible power to save your poor brother-in-law. Use your massive influence to call off those detectives. We can all go home to your beautiful mansion and be a real happy family again. Mommy loves you so much, Ebony. Mommy is so incredibly proud of you." The absolute thickness of her delusion was suffocating. She was kneeling on the stage of an exclusive country club, wearing a dress paid for by my stolen money, begging me to save the man who tried to murder me so we could all go back to my house and play happy family. The level of toxic mental gymnastics required to form those sentences was entirely beyond human comprehension. She was a parasite desperately trying to detach from a dying host and latch her sharp, greedy teeth directly into my jugular vein. I looked down at the two women kneeling at my feet, my own mother and my own sister begging and pleading and crying tears of pure selfish panic. They looked absolutely pathetic, stripped of their arrogance and their cruel high society masks. They were exposed bare and completely ugly in the bright, glaring light of truth. A deep, heavy sensation began to rise rapidly from the bottom of my stomach. It was not anger. Anger requires a certain level of passionate emotional investment. It was not sorrow or grief, because I had already mourned the death of this family a decade ago, in the freezing rain outside my childhood home. The sensation rising up and choking my throat was pure, unadulterated, visceral disgust. It felt like a physical sickness invading my body. Seeing the true, unfiltered faces of my own blood relatives completely destroyed any lingering microscopic shred of familial obligation I might have ever possessed. I was looking at two hollow, empty shells of human beings who worshipped absolutely nothing but money status and white corporate proximity. They would gladly step over my dead body to pick up a dropped dollar bill, but the second I held the entire bank in my hands, they were perfectly willing to crawl on their bellies and kiss the very shoes they used to spit on. The wealthy guests in the grand ballroom were completely silent, watching the pathetic groveling display with absolute fascination and revulsion. The same church friends who had praised Beatrice's maternal strength earlier were now shaking their heads in complete disgust, witnessing the ultimate exposure of a greedy, manipulative monster. The illusion was not just broken, it was completely incinerated, turning the air in the room thick with the toxic ashes of their ruined lives. Beatrice continued to weep, clutching my hands and repeating the word "mommy" over and over again, trying to force a maternal bond that had never actually existed in reality. Clara kept crying about her ruined reputation and her impending bankruptcy, completely ignoring the fact that her husband was currently being shoved into the back of a police cruiser outside the main entrance. They were a chaotic, swirling vortex of narcissism and delusion, and they were trying with all their remaining strength to drag me right back down into the dark, suffocating abyss with them. The crystal chandeliers above us seemed to shine even brighter, casting sharp, cold shadows across the stage. Every single camera phone in the audience was pointed directly at us, recording the absolute lowest moment of my mother's entire existence. The high society elite she worshipped were currently documenting her total humiliation, ready to spread the footage across every single social circle in the city of Atlanta by morning. She had wanted everyone to look at her tonight, and the universe had certainly granted her wish in the most devastating way possible. I stared at her manicured fingers digging into my skin. Those were the exact same fingers that had pointed toward the front door when she kicked me out, the same hands that had bagged up my personal treasures to throw in the garbage. She wanted me to believe that a decade of systematic emotional abuse was simply a clever parenting strategy designed to build my character. She wanted to rebrand her evil cruelty as maternal sacrifice. The sheer psychopathic nature of her logic was almost mathematically perfect in its complete absence of human empathy. Clara tugged at my dress, the expensive emerald silk slipping slightly in her frantic grasp. She was begging for her house, for her cars, for the lifestyle she believed she was inherently owed just for being born. She did not care that Preston was a criminal. She only cared that the money faucet had been violently shut off. They were two sides of the exact same toxic coin, perfectly reflecting the shallow, empty values they had prioritized their entire lives. I let the silence stretch out, allowing their frantic begging to echo and bounce off the high vaulted ceilings of the Chateau Elite Club. I wanted every single person in the room to hear the desperate, greedy pleas of a family that had placed a price tag on their own daughter's life. I wanted the absolute, undeniable truth of their character to be permanently etched into the minds of every executive and socialite present. The disgust in my throat finally solidified, turning into a cold, hard block of impenetrable ice. My heart rate was perfectly steady, my breathing completely controlled. The scared, rejected girl they were desperately trying to manipulate had died a long time ago, and the woman standing before them was entirely, completely immune to their poison. I yanked my hands out of Beatrice's desperate grip, stepping backward to put a massive physical distance between us. My sudden movement was so violent, she lost her balance and fell forward onto the polished floor next to her weeping golden child. I looked down at them, wallowing in their pathetic misery, and felt nothing but chilling liberation. "You want to talk about motivation?" I said, my voice cutting through the silent ballroom. "Motivation is leaving your injured daughter to die in a cold hospital room so you can attend high society parties. Motivation is planning to pull my life support to steal my assets and cash in on my tragedy. You did not push me to succeed, Beatrice. You threw me to the wolves, and you are only crying because I returned leading the pack." Beatrice looked up at me with terrified eyes, her mask of maternal love melting off her face to reveal the greedy, shallow monster underneath. She opened her mouth to spin another lie, but her voice failed her. The wealthy church ladies and corporate elites were shaking their heads in absolute revulsion. They had heard every word of my undeniable truth and were thoroughly disgusted by the woman they called a friend. Beatrice's social standing in Atlanta was instantly vaporized. She would never be invited to another country club dinner again. She was officially a pariah, a disgraced mother who tried to rob her dying child. I turned my attention away from the ruined matriarch and focused my cold stare onto Clara. My sister was still kneeling on the stage, sobbing uncontrollably as the reality of her shattered life crushed her spine. She looked so small and insignificant, stripped of her arrogant husband and her fake affluent lifestyle. I stepped closer. My steps clicked sharply against the hard wood, demanding her full attention. "You always wanted my luxury mansion and my custom Mercedes." "Clara," I said, letting a dark smile spread across my face. "You danced in my closet and cheered for my death to steal the life I built. You thought you won the ultimate prize? Well, congratulations, big sister. I am a generous woman, and I will give you exactly what you asked for. You can keep the house and keep the car." Clara suddenly stopped crying, her tear-stained face looking up at me in desperate confusion. A tiny, pathetic glimmer of hope flashed in her eyes, thinking I would show her some unearned mercy. But that shred of hope was instantly extinguished by my next sentence. "You can keep all of it," I continued, my voice dripping with lethal poison, "because Julian has prepared the legal documents to transfer the massive property tax bills and the luxury maintenance costs into your name. And since your husband Preston committed federal wire fraud using your joint marital accounts, you get to keep that massive criminal debt too. The government will seize every single penny you think you have left. You are going to be drowning in millions of dollars in federal restitution and legal fees for the rest of your miserable life. You wanted to live like a billionaire, Clara, and now you get to pay the exact price for it." Clara let out a horrific scream of agonizing despair, throwing her hands over her ears, as if she could block out the reality of her impending financial doom. She knew exactly what that meant. Without Preston's corporate salary and my stolen money, she would be completely bankrupt before the end of the month. She would be evicted from her upscale neighborhood and forced to work minimum wage jobs just to survive, exactly like she and my mother had forced me to do 10 years ago. The poetic justice was absolutely beautiful. The very trap they had so maliciously set for me had snapped shut, right around their own necks. I took a deep breath, feeling the toxic chains of my past completely fall away from my soul. I looked out at the massive crowd of shocked, silent guests, making sure every single person in the grand ballroom was paying attention to my final declaration. I stood tall and completely unbothered, a self-made titan severing the dead, rotting branches of my family tree. "Listen to me very carefully," I announced, my voice echoing through the massive room with absolute finality. "From this second onward, I have no mother, and I have no sister. You are nothing to me. You are not my blood. You are not my family. You are nothing but greedy parasites that I have just permanently cut off from my life. If you ever try to contact me again, if you ever show your faces near my home or my corporate offices, I will have my legal team crush whatever tiny pieces of your lives you have left. You are completely dead to me." I stared at them for one last long moment, ensuring that the freezing cold truth of my words penetrated the deepest layers of their delusional minds. Beatrice was sobbing into her hands, rocking back and forth on the floor, while Clara wept loudly beside her. They were utterly defeated, completely destroyed by their own bottomless greed and sickening arrogance. They had bet everything on the destruction of a black woman they deemed inferior, and they had lost the entire game. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or remorse as I looked down at their broken, weeping forms. They had dug their own graves, and now they had to lie in them. The immense, suffocating weight I had carried for decades, the desperate need for my mother's approval and my sister's validation, was entirely gone. It was completely replaced by a vast ocean of pure, limitless freedom. I had finally reclaimed my power, my identity, and my life. The ultimate scapegoat had officially risen from the ashes and burned their entire fake empire straight to the very ground. I did not look back even once as I turned on my red-bottom heels and began to walk away from the stage. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere of the grand ballroom seemed to part completely for me as I moved down the center aisle. Behind me, the sound of my mother's pathetic wailing echoed off the vaulted ceilings, mixing with Kiara's hysterical shrieking as the reality of her total financial ruin finally crushed her spirit. They were screaming my name, begging me to come back, begging for the money they thought they were entitled to simply because we shared the same blood. I completely ignored them, letting their desperate cries fade into worthless background noise. The wealthy elite guests and the corporate executives from Vanguard Holdings stepped out of my way, casting their eyes downward in absolute terrified respect. They knew they had just witnessed the complete and utter destruction of a family that had dared to cross me. I pushed open the heavy oak double doors of the Chateau Elite Club and stepped out of the suffocating, toxic environment forever. The cool, crisp air of the Atlanta night hit my face, bringing an instant, profound sense of peace to my lungs. I took a deep, slow breath, feeling the dull ache in my healing ribs, but knowing that the deepest wounds in my soul were finally completely cured. Down in the circular stone driveway, the chaotic scene was coming to a beautiful, absolute end. The bright flashing red and blue lights of 3 federal police cruisers painted the manicured hedges in harsh sweeping colors. I stood at the top of the marble steps and watched with cold, detached satisfaction as the 2 detectives forcefully shoved Preston into the back of a squad car. His protective shield of arrogant white privilege and corporate entitlement had been completely stripped away, leaving him as nothing more than a pathetic common criminal facing the devastating reality of federal prison. The heavy metal door of the police cruiser slammed shut, sealing his fate and erasing him from my world. I walked gracefully down the stone steps, leaving the flashing lights and the shattered remnants of my biological family entirely behind me. Parked quietly at the edge of the circular driveway away from the chaos was my sleek black Rolls-Royce. My private security team opened the heavy door for me, and I slid smoothly into the spacious leather interior. The contrast between the bitter, toxic destruction outside and the warm, safe environment inside the vehicle was absolutely striking. Sitting comfortably on the plush leather seats were the only 2 people who truly mattered tonight. Julian, my brilliant lawyer who had meticulously orchestrated every single legal snare, was sitting there with a quiet, victorious smile on his face. Sitting right next to him was Clara, the brave, compassionate nurse who had risked her own career to protect me when I was lying helpless and broken in that hospital bed. They looked at me with genuine pride and unwavering loyalty. They had stood by my side when I had absolutely nothing but a fractured body and a dangerous plan. I smiled back at them, feeling a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude warming my chest. They were not my blood, but they were my true, chosen family. The heavy car doors closed, shutting out the noise of the club, and we drove smoothly away into the bright glowing lights of the Atlanta skyline, leaving the ashes of my past far behind. The following months unfolded exactly as Julian and I had meticulously planned. The legal and social fallout for the people who tried to destroy me was absolutely catastrophic and completely inescapable. Preston faced a brutal federal trial where his forged documents and stolen wire transfers provided an airtight, undeniable case for the prosecution. His former friends and corporate bosses at Vanguard Holdings completely abandoned him, refusing to offer a single shred of legal support. He was swiftly convicted of first-degree felony wire fraud and corporate embezzlement, and a federal judge sentenced him to 5 long, miserable years in a maximum security penitentiary. Without Preston's corporate salary and thoroughly crushed under the massive weight of the legal fees and luxury property taxes I had transferred to her name, Clara completely drowned in insurmountable debt. The bank foreclosed on the luxury vehicles, and she was violently evicted from the affluent neighborhoods she desperately worshipped. The elite church ladies and high society socialites of Atlanta completely shunned her, treating her like an absolute pariah. She was forced to move into a tiny rundown apartment and work grueling minimum wage jobs, just to survive, finally experiencing the exact same desperate poverty she had ruthlessly mocked me for enduring a decade earlier. My mother, Beatrice, suffered a fate that was arguably much worse than financial ruin. She was left completely, utterly alone. Her fake glamorous world had been entirely incinerated, and the high society friends she had sacrificed her own daughter to impress completely cut all ties with her. She spent her days sitting in a dark, lonely apartment consumed by bitter, rotting regret. She desperately tried to contact me, leaving hundreds of pathetic, weeping voicemails and sending endless, frantic text messages, begging for a single ounce of my attention. She pleaded for forgiveness. She played the victim and she tried to manipulate my emotions, but every single message went straight into a blocked folder that I never bothered to check. My silence was absolute and permanent. I simply owed myself peace. Exactly 1 year after the horrific car crash that had nearly ended my life, I stood under the bright, warm Georgia sun, feeling completely and utterly invincible. I was wearing a tailored emerald green business suit, holding a pair of heavy golden scissors in my hands. Behind me stood the towering glass and steel structure of the brand new E Holdings Physical Rehabilitation Center. I had fully funded the construction of the massive state-of-the-art hospital using my own private equity capital to ensure that vulnerable patients would always have a safe, supportive place to heal. Standing proudly to my right, wearing her crisp white director's uniform, was Clara, whom I had personally hired to run the entire nursing department. Julian stood smiling in the front row of the massive cheering crowd. I looked at the bright red ribbon stretched tightly across the main entrance and smiled freely, feeling the warm sun on my skin. I squeezed the golden scissors and cut the ribbon, listening to the loud, joyful applause echoing around me. I had built an empire from the broken pieces of my past, and I had finally learned the most important truth in the world. Family is not the people who share your blood or the people you are born to. Family is the people who never, ever give up on you when you fall. The ultimate lesson from this story is that your worth is never determined by the people who blindly refuse to see it. Blood relation does not give anyone the right to abuse, exploit, or manipulate you for their own selfish gain. When the people who are supposed to protect you choose to throw you to the wolves, you must learn to become the leader of the pack. True healing always requires the courage to completely sever toxic ties and rebuild your life on your very own terms. Real family is entirely defined by unwavering loyalty, respect, and mutual protective care. If you have ever had to cut off toxic relatives to protect your peace, please share your experiences in the comments below and hit the subscribe button.